The wind had a voice on the plains, a ceaseless, mournful cry that scoured the land and the soul with equal indifference. It was the first thing Alara noticed when she stepped down from the train, the last passenger at a station that was little more than a sun-bleached shack in a water tower. The wind whipped her thin shawl around her face, tasting of dust and immense, terrifying emptiness. It snatched the breath from her lungs and replaced it with the grit of a world that had no place for her, no shelter to offer. Behind her, the train hissed a final, contemptuous sigh and began to pull away, its rhythmic clatter a sound of retreat, of abandonment, leaving her in a silence so profound it was its own kind of noise. 5 small hands clutched at the folds of her worn serge dress. 5 pairs of eyes, wide with a mixture of exhaustion and fear, looked up at her for an answer she did not possess. Thomas, her eldest at 10, stood stiffly, his small shoulders squared in a premature imitation of manhood. The 8-year-old twins, Martha and Mary, were pale, identical specters with braided hair already coming loose in the relentless wind. 6-year-old Samuel coughed, a dry, rattling sound that tore at her heart, his face pinched and sallow. And in her arms, bundled against the harshness of the world, 1-year-old Rose slept, her small, innocent weight both an anchor and a millstone. The advertisement had been a beacon in the suffocating darkness of her grief and poverty. Homesteading partner wanted. Sober, hard-working man of good standing seeks a wife to share in the building of a future. Must be of strong constitution and willing to work. No triflers need apply. It had been clipped from a newspaper by a well-meaning neighbor, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She had written back, her words carefully chosen, omitting the truth that would have surely ended her hopes before they began. She spoke of her strong constitution, of her willingness to work, of her desire for a new life. She had signed her name, Alara Vance, and in the space where she should have written widow with 5 children, she had written nothing at all. A lie of omission, she had told herself, a sin born of desperation. Now, the weight of that sin pressed down on her, as heavy and vast as the endless sky. The cart was there, as promised in the letter from Mr. Silas Croft. It was a simple, sturdy buckboard, hitched to a pair of mules that stood with their heads bowed against the wind. The man holding the reins was not Mr. Croft. He was a wiry, sour-faced man from the livery who spat a stream of tobacco juice near her worn boots. "You the woman for Croft?" he asked, his voice rough as gravel. Alara nodded, unable to speak past the lump of fear in her throat. His eyes traveled from her face down to the cluster of children at her skirts, and his expression curdled from indifference to open contempt. "He ain't gonna like this," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. "He ain't gonna like this one bit." He made no move to help as she lifted the children one by one onto the back of the cart, their few worldly possessions contained in 2 battered carpetbags and a wooden crate. Samuel coughed again, a racking series of spasms that left him breathless. The driver just shook his head and clucked his tongue. The ride was a silent, jarring punishment. The landscape offered no comfort, only an unending panorama of brown grass, distant, flat-topped mesas, and a sky so big it seemed to swallow the earth. There were no trees to soften the horizon, no streams to offer the sound of life. There was only the wind, the creak of the wheels, and the hammering of her own heart. She held Rose tighter, shielding her face, and prayed to a God she was no longer sure was listening. After what felt like an eternity, the driver pointed with his whip. "That's Croft's place." It was a dark shape on the horizon, a solitary outpost against the immensity of the plains. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into a small, unpainted clapboard house, a solid-looking barn, and a web of corrals. It was a stark, functional place, built to withstand the elements, not to welcome a family. A man emerged from the barn as they approached. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his form silhouetted against the dying afternoon sun. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his trousers. This had to be him, Silas Croft. He watched the carts approach, his face unreadable from a distance. Alara's breath caught. This was the moment, the collision of her desperate hope and his stark reality. As the cart rolled to a stop, the man's eyes, the color of faded slate, moved past the driver, past her, and settled on the 5 small, dirt-streaked faces peering over the side of the buckboard. For a long moment, he did not move. He simply stood there, his body rigid, the rag in his hand frozen in midair. The silence stretched, pulled taut by the wind. Alara could see his face clearly now. It was a hard face, weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of solitude and struggle, not kindness. A thick, dark beard covered his jaw, and his eyes were narrowed, not in anger, but in a kind of profound, deep-set stillness that was far more terrifying. He looked from the children to her, his gaze finally meeting hers. There was no flicker of recognition, no welcome. There was nothing, just a vast, empty space where her hope had been. The driver broke the silence. "Here she is, Croft." All of her, he cackled, a dry, ugly sound. Silas Croft's eyes never left hers. He said nothing. He did not curse. He did not shout. He did not demand an explanation. His silence was the judgment. It was the closing of a door, the turning of a key in a lock. In that crushing, absolute silence, Alara felt the last of her strength crumble. The world tilted, the endless sky pressing down, and the tears she had held back for months, for the entire desperate journey, finally broke free. They streamed down her face, hot and shameful, blurring the image of the stone-faced man who was her last and only hope. The journey to the ranch was an exercise in silent torment. Silas Croft had dismissed the liveryman with a single, curt nod and a coin pressed into his palm, the transaction as wordless as everything else about him. He had then turned his attention to the buckboard, his movements methodical as he unhitched the livery mules and led his own horse from the barn, a powerful roan that watched the children with intelligent, wary eyes. He did not speak to Alara. He did not look at her again after that first, damning survey. He simply loaded her meager belongings onto his own wagon, his hands moving with a competence that was both impressive and impersonal. He handled the worn carpetbags and the wooden crate as if they were sacks of grain, objects without history or meaning. Alara, her face still streaked with the salt of her tears, marshaled her children, herding them toward his wagon. "Climb up," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Thomas scrambled over the side with a grim determination, then reached down to help the twins. Alara lifted Samuel, his small body frighteningly light, and settled him on a pile of burlap sacks before climbing up herself with Rose. She sat with her back ramrod straight, her children clustered around her like chicks around a hen, a small, desolate island in the vast sea of the wagon bed. Silas swung himself onto the driver's seat, the wood groaning under his weight. He took up the reins, and with a soft cluck of his tongue, set the horse into motion. The ranch was farther than it had appeared, a slow, lumbering journey across the undulating plains. The setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the clouds in brutal shades of orange and purple, a beautiful, violent spectacle that offered no solace. The wind never ceased. It tugged at Samuel's blanket, and Alara pulled it tighter around him, her knuckles white. She watched the back of Silas Croft's head, the thick column of his neck, the broad set of his shoulders. He was a wall, a fortress of a man, and she had crashed against him. Her mind raced, a frantic scramble of apologies and justifications. "I had no choice. There was no one else. The children would have starved." But the words remained lodged in her throat, choked by the sheer, unbreachable wall of his silence. What could she possibly say that his eyes had not already understood? The deception was plain. He had sent for a wife, a partner. He had received a burden, a plague of mouths to feed. They arrived as the last light faded, leaving the world in shades of gray and deep blue. The house was larger up close, but no more welcoming. It was stark, square, and practical, with two windows that looked out like vacant eyes onto the darkening land. A smaller, rougher structure, little more than a shed, stood adjacent to it, connected by a covered walkway. Without a word, Silas reined in the horse and dismounted. He walked to the back of the wagon and lowered the tailgate. He looked at her then, his gaze flat and unreadable in the twilight. "This will be yours," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse, the words clipped and devoid of emotion. He gestured toward the smaller building. It was a lean-to, a storage shed, a place for tools or tack, not for people. Alara felt a fresh wave of cold dread wash over her, but she smothered it. What had she expected? The master bedroom? An invitation to sit by his fire? She had forfeited any right to such comforts with her lie. She slid from the wagon, her legs stiff and unsteady. "Children, come," she said softly. One by one, they climbed down, huddling close to her as Silas began to unload their things, setting the bags and the crate on the dirt floor of the lean-to. The space was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12. It smelled of dust, old wood, and something vaguely animal. A single, grime-covered window was set high in one wall. There was no furniture, save for a rough-hewn shelf. This was not a home. It was a holding pen. Silas carried in the last of their things and then stood in the doorway, his large frame blocking out what little light remained. "There is a well behind the main house. A privy out back. I will leave food on the porch in the morning." He paused, and for a moment, she thought he might say something more, something to condemn or question her. Instead, he simply said, "The work begins at dawn." Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the wooden walkway before the sound was swallowed by the closing of the main house door. A bar scraped heavily into place. Locked. He had locked his door against them. The finality of the sound echoed in the small, dark space. Alara stood frozen for a moment, the cold seeping up from the packed earth floor. Then she sank to her knees, pulling her children into a tight circle. Rose began to cry, a thin, hungry wail. Samuel's cough returned, harsh in the enclosed space. The twins were trembling, their faces buried in her skirts. Only Thomas was still, his small body rigid with a tension that mirrored her own. She was a fool, a desperate, hopeful fool. She had gambled everything on a lie, and she had lost. There was no partnership here, no shared future. There was only a cold room, a locked door, and the promise of work at dawn. She laid out their single spare quilt on the floor, arranging the children on it, huddling them together for warmth. She had no food for them, nothing but the last stale biscuit in her pocket, which she broke into 5 small pieces. It was a sacrament of their failure. As she lay down beside them, pulling the thin quilt over them all, the wind howled around the corners of the lean-to, a hungry predator sniffing at the walls of their flimsy shelter. She did not cry again. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. There was only the cold, the dark, and the chilling certainty that survival here would be a battle fought one breath at a time. Dawn arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a stark, gray light filtering through the grimy window, revealing the true poverty of their shelter. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts, illuminating the rough-hewn walls, the packed earth floor, and the faces of her sleeping children, their expressions unguarded and vulnerable in repose. For a moment, Alara allowed herself the indulgence of stillness, listening to the soft rhythm of their breathing, the occasional rustle as one of them shifted. They were the reason for her folly, and the source of her resolve. The sound of an axe splitting wood, a sharp, rhythmic crack, shattered the quiet. Silas Croft was already awake, already working. The sound was a summons. Alara rose quietly, her joints aching from the cold, hard floor. She smoothed her dress and tidied her hair, attempting to assemble a mask of competence over the fear that gnawed at her. She instructed Thomas to watch the others and slipped out into the frigid morning air. True to his word, a small sack and a pail of milk sat on the back porch of the main house. Inside the sack were flour, salt, and a slab of cured bacon. It was a provision, not a gift. It was fuel for the labor he expected. She carried it back to the lean-to, her mind already calculating, planning. There was no stove, no hearth. How was she to cook? Her eyes scanned the area and found a ring of stones a short distance from the barn, a place where a fire had clearly been made before. She would make do. She always had. She set Thomas to the task of finding kindling, showing him how to look for dry twigs and fallen scraps of bark near the woodpile. She sent the twins to the well with the smaller bucket, their combined strength just enough to haul it back, sloshing water over the sides. While they worked, she explored her domain. The lean-to was attached to what seemed to be a summer kitchen, a room with a large, cold hearth, a work table, and shelves. The door connecting it to the main house was bolted from the other side, but the door leading outside was not. This would be her kitchen. This would be the center of her new, constricted world. By the time Silas returned from the far pastures, the scent of frying bacon and baking bread, flat, unleavened stuff cooked on a hot stone, filled the air. Alara had found a rusted grate near the barn and scrubbed it clean with sand and water. She had fed the children, saving a portion for him. She did not know the protocol. Was she to serve him? To leave the food on the porch as he had done for her? She chose a middle path. She set a plate with the bread, bacon, and a cup of milk on the edge of the porch, then retreated to her own doorway to watch. He approached, his stride long and steady. He stopped and looked at the plate. He did not look at her. He picked it up, carried it inside his house, and closed the door. There was no word of thanks, no acknowledgement. But he had taken the food. It was a transaction. Work for sustenance. Nothing more. The days that followed fell into a harsh, unvarying rhythm. Alara rose before the sun and worked until long after it had set. Her domain was the house, or rather, the exterior of it, the summer kitchen, and the small patch of dead-looking earth she was determined to turn into a garden. She scrubbed his laundry in a wooden tub with harsh lye soap until her knuckles were raw, hanging it on a line strung between two posts where the wind whipped it dry in minutes. She mended his torn shirts, her stitches small and neat, a quiet testament to her skill. She swept the porch, beat the dust from the few rugs he owned, which she found hung over a railing one morning, another silent instruction. She cooked 3 meals a day, leaving them on the porch for him to retrieve. He, in turn, left provisions, a sack of potatoes, a basket of eggs, a joint of meat from a freshly slaughtered calf. Their communication was entirely through these offerings, a silent, bartered language of survival. He worked his own relentless schedule. He was gone from dawn till dusk, a distant figure on horseback, checking fence lines, tending to his cattle. He moved with a tireless, solitary energy, a man perfectly attuned to the demanding rhythms of his land. He never spoke to her. He barely seemed to see her, but she knew he was watching. She felt his gaze on her sometimes as she worked in the garden, turning over the hard, unforgiving soil with a rusty spade she'd found. He would be standing by the corral, ostensibly checking a saddle strap, but his stillness betrayed a focused attention. He watched her interactions with the children, the way she soothed Rose's crying or patiently showed the twins how to pull weeds. He saw everything. The children, for their part, adapted with the resilience of the young. They created a small world for themselves within the confines of the ranch yard. The twins invented elaborate games with stones and twigs. Rose learned to crawl, and then to toddle, on the patch of earth outside the lean-to. Samuel, however, remained a constant worry. The dry, dusty air aggravated his weak lungs, and his cough persisted. One evening, it worsened into a fever. His small body burned with heat, his breathing shallow and ragged. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Alara. There was no doctor, no medicine. She was alone. She did what she had always done. She drew on the knowledge passed down from her mother. She brewed a tea from the willow bark she'd gathered near a dry creek bed, a bitter concoction to bring down the fever. She crushed wild mint she'd found growing in a sheltered patch and made a poultice for his chest to ease his breathing. All night she sat with him, bathing his forehead with cool water, murmuring soft words of comfort, praying with a ferocity born of terror. She did not sleep. The next morning, when she went to the porch to retrieve the milk, she was exhausted, her face pale with worry. Silas was there, loading supplies onto a pack mule. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. For the first time, his gaze held something other than blank assessment. He looked at her drawn face, the dark circles under her eyes. "The boy?" he asked. The 2 words were startling in the quiet morning. She was so unused to hearing his voice directed at her that she almost didn't answer. "He is unwell," she said, her own voice a thin whisper. "A fever," Silas grunted, a noncommittal sound, and turned back to his work, tightening a cinch with a hard tug. Alara felt a familiar pang of dismissal and turned to go. But when she returned to the lean-to, her heart pounding with the strain of the night, she found something new by her door. It was a small pile of freshly split oak, much denser and slower burning than the cottonwood scraps she had been gathering. It was enough to keep a steady, warm fire going for a full day and night. He had left it there for her, an unspoken acknowledgement of her struggle, a silent, practical offering of help. It was not kindness, not yet, but it was something. The small pile of oak was a turning point, a subtle shift in the tectonic plates of their silent arrangement. It was fuel not just for the fire that warmed Samuel, whose fever finally broke the following day, but for a tiny, flickering ember of hope within Alara herself. It was the first indication that he saw her not just as a pair of hands, but as a person with needs, with fears. She began to observe him more closely, looking for other cracks in his stoic facade. She saw the way he gentled the skittish new foal, his large, rough hands surprisingly patient. She saw the careful way he mended a broken harness, his work precise and built to last. He was a man who understood the value of things, who knew that survival depended on careful stewardship, on fixing what was broken rather than discarding it. She wondered if he might one day see her and her broken family in the same light. The children, sensing the slight thaw in the frigid atmosphere, began to venture further from the protective circle of the lean-to. Thomas, driven by a boy's innate need for a man's approval, began to shadow Silas. He would stand by the corral fence for hours, watching Silas work with the horses. He never spoke, never asked to help, but his presence was a constant, silent question. One afternoon, Silas was repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by cattle. He worked with a grim efficiency, pulling the wire taut with a stretcher. Thomas stood nearby, holding a handful of fence staples he had gathered, his small face a mask of concentration. Silas finished a section and reached into his leather pouch for more staples, only to find it empty. He grunted in frustration and was about to turn back toward the barn when Thomas took a hesitant step forward, his hand outstretched, offering the staples. Silas looked down at the small, upturned palm, then up at the boy's earnest face. He didn't smile, but the hard line of his mouth softened almost imperceptibly. He took the staples without a word, but as he turned back to his work, he said, "Hold the post steady." It was an order, but for Thomas, it was a coronation. The boy's face lit up with a fierce pride, and he threw his whole wiry strength into holding the wooden post, while Silas hammered the staples home. From that day on, Thomas had a purpose. He became Silas's self-appointed assistant, fetching tools, carrying water, his small feet scurrying to keep up with the man's long strides. Silas never offered praise, but he stopped ignoring the boy. He would hand him a tool without looking, confident it would be taken, or gesture for a bucket, knowing it would be brought. It was a partnership forged in the shared language of work. The twins, Martha and Mary, were more timid. They remained Alara's helpers, their movements quiet and synchronized as they helped with the laundry or the weeding. They were like two small, watchful birds, always aware of the large, quiet man who moved at the periphery of their world. One afternoon, while sweeping the porch, Mary dropped her most prized possession, a doll made from a bundle of rags, with button eyes and yarn hair. It was a clumsy, lopsided thing, a relic from their former life, but she loved it fiercely. The doll fell into the deep dust beneath the porch. Mary gave a small, choked cry, but was too frightened to try and retrieve it. Later that day, as dusk settled over the ranch, Alara was inside the summer kitchen, kneading dough for the next day's bread. She glanced out the window and saw Silas returning from the barn. He stopped near the porch and bent down, his large frame looking awkward as he reached into the dusty space beneath the floorboards. When he straightened up, he was holding the rag doll. For a moment, he just stood there, looking at the crude little figure in his hand. His thumb gently brushed a smudge of dirt from one of its button eyes. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it made Alara's breath catch in her throat. He looked around, as if to ensure he was not being watched. Satisfied he was alone, he placed the doll carefully on the top step of the porch, propping it up so it looked like it was waiting for its owner. Then he turned and went into his house. Alara stared at the doll sitting on the step, a small, lonely sentinel in the growing darkness. He could have left it in the dust. He could have ignored it completely. But he had not. He had seen its value to a small child and had taken the time to restore it to her. Later, when she sent Mary to fetch a dipper of water, the little girl's gasp of pure joy was a sound that warmed the entire yard. She came running back, clutching the doll to her chest, as if it were a lost lamb returned to the fold. That night, as Alara left Silas's supper on the porch, she hesitated for a moment. The distance between her lean-to and his front door had always felt like a mile-wide chasm. Now, it felt infinitesimally smaller. She did not have the words to thank him, and he would not have welcomed them. But as she turned to leave, she noticed his work coat hanging on a peg, a long tear in the sleeve. The next morning, when he came out, the coat was still there, but the sleeve was neatly mended, the stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. He stopped and ran his fingers over the repair, his head bowed. He did not look toward her, but he stood there for a long time before putting the coat on and heading out for the day. The first frost came early, a silver blanket that crisped the edges of the prairie grass and signaled the coming of a leaner, harder season. Alara's small garden had yielded a meager but precious harvest of potatoes, tough-skinned squash, and beans, which she carefully stored. But it was not enough. They needed flour, salt, sugar, coffee, staples that could not be coaxed from the stubborn earth. The time had come when she could no longer avoid the one place she dreaded, the town of redemption. It was a full day's journey away, and the thought of facing a community of strangers filled her with a familiar, cold anxiety. She had no money of her own, only a small list of necessities. She approached Silas one evening as he was oiling a harness near the barn. He worked under the light of a lantern, the focused movements of his hands creating a small circle of industry in the vast darkness. "Mr. Croft," she began, her voice small in the open air. He stopped his work, but did not look up. "We are in need of supplies from town." He continued to draw the oiled rag along a leather strap, his silence an unnerving void she was forced to fill. "Flour," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "And salt. The children need warmer clothes for winter. I can mend and alter, but the fabric," she trailed off. It felt like begging. He finished the strap and set it aside, finally turning his head to look at her. The lantern light carved deep shadows into his face, making his expression impossible to read. "Be ready after chores tomorrow," he said. It was not a discussion. It was a command. The next morning, he hitched the horse to the wagon. Alara had decided to leave the younger children with Thomas, whose newfound sense of responsibility made him a solemn and capable guardian. The journey was as silent as her first ride to the ranch, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer a heavy, suffocating blanket of judgment. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding of the landscape they both inhabited. He handled the reins with an easy, confident grip, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. She sat on the hard wooden bench, her hands clasped in her lap, watching the familiar, monotonous scenery roll by. Redemption was a dusty collection of clapboard buildings huddled along a single main street, a lonely outpost of civilization. As Silas guided the wagon down the street, Alara felt the stares. Windows parted. Conversations on the boardwalk paused. Eyes followed them, filled with a sharp, pointed curiosity. They were an anomaly, the solitary, forbidding rancher and the strange woman with a past no one knew. At the general store, the feeling intensified. The proprietor, a man with a pinched face and watery eyes named Henderson, greeted Silas with a grudging respect born of commerce. But his gaze slid to Alara, lingering with an unpleasant mixture of suspicion and appraisal. "Silas," he said, his voice oily. "And she needs supplies," Silas stated flatly, cutting off any further inquiry. He handed the man a list Alara had prepared. As Henderson gathered the items, other customers drifted in, their errands suddenly urgent. Women in dark calico dresses whispered behind their hands, their eyes flicking toward Alara. She could feel their judgment like a physical blow. Who is she? What is a woman like that doing out at the Croft place? She kept her eyes down, focusing on a loose floorboard, wishing she could become invisible. A stout woman with a face like a sour apple, whom Alara later learned was the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, stepped forward. "Silas Croft," she said, her voice carrying a tone of public authority. "It is the talk of the town that you are harboring a woman of uncertain circumstances." And with a flock of children, no less, the store fell silent. Everyone was listening. Alara's cheeks burned with shame. She felt stripped bare, her desperate circumstances laid out for public dissection. Silas, who had been inspecting a bolt of wool flannel, turned slowly. He was taller than anyone else in the store, and his presence seemed to suck the air from the room. He looked at Mrs. Gable, his slate-gray eyes holding no deference. "She is not being harbored," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "She works for her keep." He paused, letting the words settle. "My ranch. My business." The finality in his tone was absolute. It was a wall, and no one in that store dared to try and scale it. Mrs. Gable's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound came out. She flushed a deep, mottled red, and turned away, busying herself with a barrel of pickles. Henderson scurried to finish bagging their supplies, his earlier smugness replaced by a nervous efficiency. Silas paid for the goods, his movements unhurried. He loaded the sacks and bolts of fabric onto the wagon, and then helped Alara up onto the seat, his hand briefly and firmly on her elbow. It was the first time he had ever touched her. The physical contact was brief, impersonal, but it sent a jolt through her. It was an anchor in the swirling sea of shame and hostility. The ride back to the ranch began in the same silence as the ride in. But as the last rooftops of redemption disappeared behind them, Alara felt a profound shift. He had defended her, not with kindness or affection, but with a hard, unyielding claim of proprietorship. My ranch. My business. He had drawn a line in the dust of that town and placed her, and her children, on his side of it. She risked a glance at his profile. He was staring ahead at the horizon, his jaw set, his expression as unreadable as ever. But she was not looking at a stranger anymore. She was looking at the man who had, in his own gruff and silent way, stood for her. A fragile, unspoken alliance had been forged in the crucible of public scorn. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of that moment. In the weeks that followed their trip to town, the alliance settled into a new kind of normal. The work continued, the seasons turned, but the ground beneath their feet felt more solid. Alara sewed new shirts for the boys and warm dresses for the girls from the flannel Silas had bought. The act of creating something new, of clothing her children in fabric that wasn't worn thin with age and grief, was a quiet joy. She even made a new shirt for Silas, of a dark blue that matched the deepest color of the twilight sky. She left it folded on the porch with his dinner, and the next day, he was wearing it. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for winter. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, but the wind carried a new, sharper edge. The cattle grew thick, shaggy coats. Silas worked with a renewed urgency, reinforcing the barn, checking the roof of the house, and chopping a formidable mountain of firewood that grew higher each day. He was preparing for a siege. Alara felt it too, a primal instinct to gather and store, to secure her small family against the coming cold. One afternoon, the sky began to change. The brilliant blue bled into a strange, bruised yellow-gray along the western horizon. The air grew heavy and still, the perpetual wind dying down to an eerie calm. Silas rode in from the pastures early, his horse skittish, its ears twitching. He dismounted and scanned the horizon, his face grim. "A storm's coming," he said, not to her specifically, but to the world at large. A bad one. The stillness was broken. A low, menacing rumble echoed from the distance, and the wind returned with a sudden, violent gust that rattled the windows of the house and sent dust devils dancing across the yard. The preparations became frantic. It was no longer his work and her work. It was simply the work, and they moved together in an unspoken choreography of purpose. He directed, his orders clipped and precise. "Bring the chickens into the barn, help me with this shutter, draw as much water as you can hold." All the buckets. Alara relayed the orders to the children. Thomas, his face serious, helped Silas wrestle a heavy wooden shutter over a window on the main house. The twins, their fear forgotten in the face of urgent tasks, scurried back and forth from the well, their small buckets adding to the precious store of water. Alara secured the door to the summer kitchen and carried their food stores, the sacks of flour and potatoes, into the lean-to, stacking them against the most sheltered wall. The sky grew darker, the yellow-gray turning to a churning, malevolent black. The temperature plummeted. The wind began to howl, a rising shriek that sounded like a living thing in agony. Silas worked on the barn, securing the heavy doors with a thick wooden bar. Alara gathered her children, pulling them into the relative safety of the lean-to just as the first pellets of ice began to fall, hitting the tin roof with sharp, angry cracks. She huddled with them on the quilt, a single lantern casting a flickering, unsteady light against the rough walls. The storm was no longer coming. It was upon them. The wind was a physical force, a battering ram that slammed against their small shelter. The walls groaned and shuddered. The roof rattled as if it were about to be torn away. Rose cried in her arms, a terrified wail that was nearly lost in the deafening roar from outside. Samuel was coughing again, the cold, damp air seeping through the cracks in the walls and settling deep in his chest. Alara tried to sing to them, a lullaby from a lifetime ago, but her voice was thin and trembling, swallowed by the storm's fury. A sudden, splintering crash from outside made them all jump. Alara's heart leaped into her throat. It sounded like a tree, though there were no trees to speak of near the house. A moment later, the door to the lean-to was flung open, and Silas stood there, framed against a swirling vortex of snow and ice. He was covered in it, his beard and eyebrows white, his coat plastered to his broad shoulders. "The walkway roof is gone," he yelled over the wind. "Get into the house." Now, there was no time to argue, no time to think. She grabbed the lantern and the quilt, herding her frightened children ahead of her. They ran the short, exposed distance to the main house, pelted by stinging ice, the wind trying to tear them from their feet. Silas was right behind them, shielding them with his own body, pushing them through the door he held open. He slammed it shut against the raging storm and threw the heavy bar into place. The relative quiet inside was shocking. The storm was still a roar, but it was muffled, kept at bay by the thick walls of his home. They stood dripping and trembling in a small, sparsely furnished room that served as both kitchen and living space. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire burning within it. It was the first time Alara and the children had ever been inside his house. It was clean, orderly, and profoundly masculine. A table and 2 chairs, a shelf of books, a gun rack on the wall. It was the space of a man who lived entirely alone. Silas moved immediately to the fireplace, adding logs from a nearby woodbox. The flames leaped up, casting a warm, dancing light over the room. "Get them warm," he ordered, shrugging out of his frozen coat. Alara led the children to the hearth, settling them on the floor in front of the fire, wrapping them in the quilt. The warmth felt like a miracle, but the house was not immune to the storm's power. The entire structure vibrated with the force of the wind, and the windows rattled violently in their frames. A particularly vicious gust was followed by the sickening sound of shattering glass from another room. Silas swore under his breath and disappeared into the darkness of the hallway. Alara could hear him hammering, blocking the broken window against the storm's intrusion. He returned moments later, brushing snow from his sleeves. He looked at the small, huddled group by his fire. He looked at Samuel, who was seized by a fit of coughing that left him pale and gasping for air. His eyes met Alara's over the children's heads. In that moment, the storm outside was matched by a storm of fear inside her. This small, fragile house was their only refuge, and this large, silent man was their only protector. The barriers between them, the porch, the separate doorways, the unspoken contract, had been obliterated by the sheer, indiscriminate violence of the storm. They were no longer a rancher and his hired help. They were simply people, trapped together, fighting for shelter against a world trying to tear itself apart. The night was a long siege. The storm never relented, its fury a constant, deafening assault on the small house. Sleep was impossible. Every fresh blast of wind, every groan of the roof timbers, sent a new jolt of fear through Alara. She sat with her back against the warm stones of the hearth, her children asleep in a tangled heap under the quilt at her feet. Rose was nestled in the crook of her arm, her small body finally relaxed in slumber. Only Samuel was restless, his breathing a constant, wheezing struggle in the cold air that seeped in from the boarded-up window. Silas did not sleep either. He sat in one of the wooden chairs at the table, a dark, silent shape in the firelight. For hours, he did nothing but watch the fire, his posture rigid, his hands resting on his knees. He was a sentinel, a guardian at his post. He seemed to be listening to the storm, judging its strength, anticipating its next attack. The house was his ship, and he was its captain, navigating a treacherous sea. Alara watched him through her lashes, pretending to doze. She watched the firelight play across his hard features, softening the harsh lines around his eyes and mouth. She saw not just the stoic rancher, but a man bearing the full weight of responsibility, not just for his property, but for the 6 vulnerable lives that had been unexpectedly thrust into his care. He had not asked for this. He had been deceived, his plans for a simple, hard-working wife upended. He had every right to be angry, to resent their presence in his solitary space. Yet, Here he was, standing watch over them. Around midnight, Samuel's coughing worsened. It was a deep, racking sound that shook his small frame. He cried out in his sleep, his face flushed with fever. Alara's heart clenched with a familiar, terrifying helplessness. She shifted to cradle him, trying to soothe him, but his breathing grew more ragged. Silas rose from his chair. His movement was so sudden that Alara flinched. He walked to a large wooden chest in the corner of the room, knelt, and lifted the heavy lid. He rummaged inside for a moment before pulling out a thick, heavy wool blanket, the kind used for wintering horses, but it was clean and smelled of cedar. He walked over to the hearth and held it out to her. "This will be warmer," he said, his voice low so as not to wake the others. He then disappeared down the dark hallway and returned with a pillow from his own bed. He gestured toward a door she hadn't noticed before. "My room. It's the smallest. Holds the heat best. Take him in there." Alara stared at him, stunned. He was offering his own bed, his private sanctuary, to her sick child. I can't," she stammered. "You need your rest." "I'm not sleeping," he stated, as if it were the most obvious fact in the world. "The boy needs warmth." Go, his tone left no room for argument. Overwhelmed by a wave of gratitude so profound it felt like grief, she gathered the feverish Samuel in her arms, wrapping him in the thick wool blanket. She carried him into the small, Spartan room. It contained only a narrow bed with a rope frame, a small table, and a single window that was thankfully intact. The room was, as he'd said, noticeably warmer, sheltered from the main force of the wind. She laid Samuel down on the bed, and he immediately quieted, his breathing seeming to ease in the still, warm air. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand on his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his heart begin to slow. After a few minutes, she slipped out, closing the door quietly behind her, and returned to her spot by the fire with the other children. Silas was back in his chair, staring into the flames as if he had never moved. He did not acknowledge her return. He had offered his help in the only way he knew how, with a quiet, practical gesture that cost him his own comfort. There were no words of sympathy, no gentle reassurances. There was only a warm room, a thick blanket, and the silent vigil of a man who met a crisis not with words, but with action. As the hours crawled by, the storm seemed to lose some of its manic intensity. The wind still howled, but the house no longer felt as if it were on the verge of being torn from its foundations. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and a deep, exhausted quiet settled over the room. Alara finally drifted into a fitful sleep, her head resting against the stone chimney. She dreamed of a ship on a dark sea, and a lone lighthouse keeper who refused to let the light go out. She awoke with a start, not knowing what had woken her. The room was filled with a dim, gray light. The storm had passed, the wind had fallen away, and the silence was as shocking as the earlier noise. Silas was standing at the main window, his back to her, looking out at the dawn. He had pulled back the heavy curtain, and through the glass, she could see a world transformed. Everything was covered in a thick, pristine blanket of white. The snow was piled in deep drifts against the house and barn, sculpting the familiar landscape into something new and strange. It was a world wiped clean. Silas turned from the window, his gaze meeting hers across the room. The weariness of the long night was etched on his face, but his eyes were clear. "It's over," he said. And in those two simple words, there was a shared truth. They had endured. Together. They emerged from the house into a world of blinding white and deafening silence. The snow was waist-deep in places, sculpted by the wind into elegant, treacherous drifts. The devastation the storm had wrought was starkly visible. The covered walkway between the house and the lean-to was a tangle of splintered wood. A section of the corral fence was completely gone, buried under a mountain of snow. The roof of the chicken coop had collapsed. It was a scene of profound destruction, enough to break a man's spirit. Alara stood on the porch, pulling her shawl tighter, the cold air a shock to her lungs. The sheer scale of the work ahead was overwhelming. For a moment, despair threatened to reclaim her. They had survived the night, but how would they survive the aftermath? Silas stood beside her, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He surveyed the damage with a calm, assessing eye, his expression revealing nothing. He was not looking at what was lost. He was calculating what needed to be done. He looked at the wrecked walkway, then at the barn, then at the vast, snow-covered expanse where his cattle would be, trapped and hungry. He turned and looked at her, at the children who had followed them out onto the porch and were staring, wide-eyed, at the transformed world. His gaze rested on Thomas, who stood straight and tall, trying to mirror the man's stoicism. Then he looked at Alara, a long, steady look that held the weight of the night they had just passed. There was a new understanding in his eyes, an acknowledgement of a shared ordeal. He had seen her fear for her children, and she had seen his resolute fight to protect them all. The pretense of their original arrangement, employer and hired help, had been stripped away by the storm, leaving something more fundamental in its place. Two people bound by the common goal of survival. Silas went into the barn and returned with two heavy shovels. He handed one to Alara. It was a simple gesture, but it was profound. He was not sending her to the kitchen to cook while he handled the man's work. He was giving her a tool, acknowledging her as a partner in the immense task of reclamation. He then walked over to a smaller shed and came back with a small, sturdy-looking hammer. He held it out to Thomas. "We'll start with the fence," he said. "The cattle will have drifted. We need to find them." It was not a request. It was an induction. Thomas's face, which had been pale with shock, flushed with purpose. He took the hammer with a reverence usually reserved for a sacred object. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. The work was brutal. The snow was heavy and wet. Every shovelful was a struggle. They started by clearing a path to the barn, their movements falling into a shared rhythm. Silas, with his immense strength, cleared the deepest drifts, while Alara and Thomas worked to widen the path behind him. The twins, seeing their mother and brother at work, insisted on helping. Silas found 2 small feed scoops for them, and they set about clearing the snow from the porch steps with a fierce, concentrated energy that belied their size. Inside the barn, the animals were safe but restless. The sounds of their hunger filled the space. Silas and Thomas immediately set to work, forking hay into the mangers. Alara, with the girls, checked on the chickens, managing to rescue a half-dozen frightened birds from the collapsed coop. She found a sheltered corner in the barn and fashioned a temporary roost for them. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary talk. The shared purpose was a language all its own. Feed the animals. Clear the path. Find the cattle. These were the imperatives that drove them. By midday, they had cleared a path to the woodpile and the well. Alara went inside to the main house, her house, now, for all intents and purposes, and stoked the fire, putting on a large pot of water to heat. She found potatoes and onions in Silas's pantry and began making a thick, hearty soup. The smell of it filled the small house, a promise of warmth and sustenance. While she cooked, she checked on Samuel. He was still asleep in Silas's bed, his fever down, his breathing slow and even. The warmth of the room had been the medicine he needed. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead, a wave of fierce, protective love washing over her. They were surviving. They were all surviving. Later that afternoon, Silas announced he was going to look for the cattle. He saddled his roan, the horse's hooves sinking deep into the snow. "Stay close to the house," he told Alara. "The drifts are deep." It was a warning, but also a statement of trust. He was leaving her in charge of the homestead, of his home. She watched him ride out, a solitary figure moving across the vast, white landscape, until he was just a dark speck against the horizon. He was going to fight for his livelihood, for the future of this ranch. And she realized, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was no longer just a temporary resident. She was fighting for it too. This was not just his ranch. It was the only home her children had. It was the place where they had weathered the storm. As she turned to go back inside, her eyes fell on the wreckage of the walkway. It was a reminder of the barrier that had once stood between them. The storm had torn it down, and in its place, they would have to build something new. The days that followed the great storm were a testament to the relentless demands of the land and the quiet resilience of its inhabitants. Silas returned late the first day, half frozen but successful, having found most of his herd sheltering in a deep coulee a few miles north. He had lost some, but the core of his livelihood was intact. The recovery of the ranch became the sole focus of their existence, a shared labor that erased the last vestiges of their former, separate lives. They worked from the first gray light of dawn until the purple shadows of dusk swallowed the snowy plains, their bodies aching with a fatigue so deep it felt like it had settled in their bones. But it was a productive ache, the feeling of a battle being won, inch by hard-won inch. The unspoken partnership that had been forged in the heart of the storm solidified into a daily reality. Silas would outline the day's tasks with a few terse words over their morning meal of oatmeal and coffee, and they would set to it without question. The north fence line needs resetting. We need to clear the snow from the barn roof before it collapses. Thomas, you'll help me. Alara, the animals, she no longer ate with the children in the lean-to. The storm had rendered it uninhabitable, and no one suggested they move back. They took all their meals together at the table in the main house. The 6 of them crowded into the small space. The house, which had once seemed so stark and empty, was now filled with the small sounds of a family. The twins whispering over a shared piece of bread, Rose babbling from her makeshift cradle by the fire, Samuel's occasional cough, now much weaker and less frequent. Silas never commented on the change, but he had begun to leave a small block of wood on the hearth each evening. After supper, while Alara cleaned up, he would take out his pocket knife and begin to carve. His large, calloused hands, so capable of wrestling a steer or splitting an oak log, moved with a surprising delicacy. The children would watch, mesmerized, as a small, perfect shape began to emerge from the wood. First, it was a horse, its head arched, its mane flowing. He worked on it for 3 nights before he was satisfied. When it was done, he sanded it smooth with a piece of leather and handed it, without a word, to Martha. Her eyes grew wide with wonder as she took the small, perfect gift. The next week, he carved a bird with outstretched wings for Mary and a small, sturdy-looking cow for Samuel. These small tokens were his way of speaking to them, a language of quiet craft that bypassed his natural reticence. He was building a bond with her children, one sliver of wood at a time. Alara, in turn, found her own ways to transform the house from his solitary shelter into their shared home. She used a needle and thread to mend the rips in the curtains and wash them until they were no longer gray with dust. She found a patch of hardy winter herbs under the snow near the foundation of the house and began to use them in her cooking, filling the rooms with savory smells that had never before graced its walls. She organized his pantry, scrubbed his floors, and brought an order and warmth to the space that went beyond mere cleanliness. She was nesting, creating a place of comfort and security for her children in the heart of this harsh land. One evening, she was darning a hole in Thomas's sock by the firelight while Silas worked on his carving. The children were asleep. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft scrape of his knife on the wood. "Your husband," Silas said, the words coming out of the silence so unexpectedly that she looked up with a start. What was he like? It was the first personal question he had ever asked her. It was an opening, a key turning in a long-locked door. She set down her sewing, her hands trembling slightly. "His name was John," she said softly, the name feeling strange on her tongue after so long. "He was a good man. A carpenter. He was kind." She looked into the fire, seeing his face there. He was not strong. His lungs were weak. The city sickness took him last winter. It took everything with it. She did not need to elaborate. He would understand the poverty, the desperation, that followed. She fell silent, the memories a dull ache in her chest. Silas stopped carving. He looked at the small, half-finished wolf in his hand, then at her. He would be proud of them, he said, his gaze gesturing toward the sleeping children. "You've raised them well. They're strong." The simple, unadorned praise was more powerful than any flowery sentiment. It was an acknowledgement of her struggle, a validation of her motherhood. It was him seeing her, truly seeing her, not as a burden or a deception, but as a woman who had fought to keep her family intact. A tear slipped down her cheek, hot and surprising. She wiped it away quickly, but not before he saw it. He said nothing more, simply returned to his carving, but the space between them was filled with a new and profound intimacy. They were 2 solitary people, survivors of their own private shipwrecks, who had found themselves on the same shore. The work of rebuilding the ranch was hard, but the work of building a home, she was discovering, was a slower, more delicate craft, carved out of shared silence, quiet gestures, and the slow, steady accumulation of trust. Spring arrived not as a gentle transition, but as a messy, dramatic thaw. The world dissolved into a sea of mud. The creeks, which had been silent veins of ice, swelled into rushing, brown torrents. The prairie, so long dormant under its blanket of white, began to show patches of an almost impossibly vibrant green. The new season brought with it a new kind of work, no less demanding than the work of winter survival. It was the work of planting, of new life, of building for a future. They repaired the collapsed chicken coop and rebuilt the corral fence, stronger this time. Silas showed Thomas how to set the posts deep, how to stretch the wire until it sang with tension. Alara, with the girls, tilled the small garden patch, turning over the rich, dark soil that had been nourished by the melted snow. Silas brought the plow and his horse to help her break the toughest ground, his presence in her garden a quiet acknowledgement that its success was now part of the ranch's success. The lean-to, a wreck of splintered boards, was the last major repair. One Saturday, Silas began to tear down the ruined structure. Alara came out to help him, prying bent nails from the old wood. "I can mend the walls," she said, assuming they would rebuild it as it was. "The roof will need new timber." Silas stopped his work and looked at the pile of salvaged wood, then at the wall of the main house where the lean-to had been attached. "No sense in building it the same," he said, more to himself than to her. "The wind will just take it again." He walked the perimeter of the foundation, his long strides measuring the space. It would be better to add on to the house proper. A real room, with a floor, and a proper hearth. Alara stared at him, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. He was not talking about rebuilding her temporary shelter. He was talking about expanding his home. He was talking about making a permanent place for them. The unspoken question hung in the air between them, as tangible as the scent of the damp earth. The days grew longer, warmer. A sense of permanence began to settle over them. The children's laughter became a common sound in the ranch yard. Rose took her first steps on the new green grass, her small, unsteady journey from Alara's arms to Silas's outstretched hands a symbol of the bridge they had all crossed. Even the town of Redemption seemed to have softened its judgment. When Silas went for supplies, he returned with a message that the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, had left a bundle of outgrown children's clothing at the general store for them. It was a peace offering, a grudging acceptance of the new reality at the Croft Ranch. One evening in late spring, after the children were asleep, Alara and Silas sat on the porch. The air was soft and cool, alive with the chirping of crickets. A full moon hung in the vast, starry sky, illuminating the landscape in a soft, silver light. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They had grown comfortable in these shared silences, no longer feeling the need to fill them. It was Silas who finally broke the quiet. "The woman I sent for," he began, his voice a low rumble. He did not look at her, but stared out at the moonlit prairie. "Her name was Agnes. From Ohio. She wrote that she was stout and plain and had no family." She sounded practical. Alara's breath caught. He had never spoken of this. She had never dared to ask. "I thought a practical woman was what this place needed," he continued. "Someone who wouldn't be afraid of the work. Someone who wouldn't mind the quiet." He paused, turning a small, smooth stone over and over in his palm. "I was a fool. I thought building a life was like building a fence. You just needed the right materials and a strong back." He fell silent again, and Alara waited, her heart pounding. "This place doesn't need a practical woman," he said, his voice softer now. "It needs a heart. It was just a house before. Wood and nails. You and the children. You've made it a home." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes dark and serious in the moonlight. "I was angry that first day. Angry at the deception. But I look at what you've done here. What we've done. The storm. It would have broken me if I had faced it alone." The vulnerability in his admission was more intimate than any touch. He was showing her the solitary, lonely man beneath the stoic exterior. "I did what I had to do," she whispered. "For my children, I know," he said. He reached out, not to touch her, but to place the smooth, warm stone he'd been holding on the railing beside her hand. "The advertisement, it was a lie. I wasn't looking for a partner. I was just looking for a pair of hands. But a partnership is what this place needs. It's what I need." He stood up then, as if the confession had cost him all his energy. "I'll start on the new room tomorrow," he said, his voice back to its usual gruffness. He went inside, leaving her alone on the porch with the silvered landscape and the small, warm stone. It was not a proposal of marriage, not in the traditional sense. It was something more profound. It was an offering. A statement of need. A quiet, honest request for her to stay and build a life with him, not as his hired help, but as his partner. And as Alara picked up the stone, its smoothness a comfort in her palm, she knew her answer. She had found her home not in a place, but in the shared struggle to create one. Autumn painted the plains in hues of gold and russet. The harvest from the garden, nurtured by a gentle summer, was bountiful. Jars of preserved vegetables lined the shelves of the pantry, a colorful testament to their shared labor. The new room was finished, a solid, well-built space with a floor of smooth planed wood and its own small, efficient hearth. It was the children's room, and the sound of their sleeping breaths filled it each night, a peaceful rhythm that had become the heartbeat of the house. The ranch was no longer a place of stark survival, but one of quiet prosperity. The herd was healthy, the fences were strong, and the barn was filled with hay for the coming winter. The hardships of the past year had forged them into a seamless unit. They moved around each other with an economy of motion born of deep familiarity, their separate tasks weaving together to form the fabric of a single, shared life. Silas had taught Thomas how to read the sky for weather and the ground for tracks. Alara had taught the twins to sew and to cook, to identify the wild herbs that grew along the creek bed. They were raising the children together, passing on the skills needed to thrive in this demanding world. The evenings had taken on a comfortable, cherished ritual. After the supper dishes were cleared, they would gather by the fire in the main room. Alara would read to the children from one of the few books on Silas's shelf, her voice soft in the warm, flickering light. Silas would sit in his chair, carving, his knife still and silent as he listened to the story. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a solid, reassuring anchor in the center of their small circle. He had carved an entire family of wooden animals now, a veritable ark that the children played with for hours on the rag rug before the fire. One evening, as a cool wind rattled the window panes, a reminder of the season to come, Alara was mending a tear in Silas's flannel shirt. The children were asleep in their new room. The house was quiet, filled only with the sound of the wind and the crackling fire. Silas was watching her, his carving lying forgotten in his lap. Alara, he said. He rarely used her name, and the sound of it, spoken in his low, quiet voice, made her look up. His face was serious, his gaze direct. There is a circuit preacher who comes through redemption once a season. He will be there next week. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. He did not ask a question. He did not need to. It was an offering, laid before her with the same quiet gravity as the pile of oak he had left by her door so many months ago. It was a proposal stripped of all romance, yet filled with a profound and abiding respect. He was offering her his name, the protection and legitimacy that came with it. He was offering to make their unspoken partnership a public and permanent vow. Alara looked down at the shirt in her hands, at the needle weaving in and out of the sturdy fabric, closing the tear, making it whole again. It was what she had done for this family, for this home, for this man. It was what he had done for her. They had taken the broken pieces of their separate lives and, through shared work and silent understanding, mended them together. She met his gaze across the flickering light. Her heart was not pounding with girlish excitement, but with a deep, calm certainty. This was not the future she had ever imagined for herself, but it was a future she had earned, a future she had built. She did not need to speak her answer aloud. He could see it in her eyes. She simply nodded, a single, profound gesture of acceptance. A slow smile touched Silas's lips, a rare sight that transformed his stern face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He reached across the small space between them and gently took her hand, his large, rough palm enveloping hers. His touch was not passionate, but it was solid, warm, and deeply reassuring. It felt like coming home. Outside, the wind could howl its mournful song, and the vast, empty plains could stretch to an unforgiving horizon. Here, within the sturdy walls of the home they had built together, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the quiet promise in each other's eyes, they were safe. Alara Vance had arrived a desperate, weeping widow, a lie on her lips and fear in her heart. She would go to the preacher as Alara Croft, a woman who had discovered that resilience was not the absence of fear, but the strength to build a life in spite of it. Her future was no longer a question mark, but a solid, unwavering line, as straight and true as a well-built fence stretching toward the horizon.